Also, some Hebrew Israelites today claim medieval Iberian Sephardic Jews who regularly called God Allah when writing in Arabic. It's definitely corny. They're Arabs, a linguistic group, so they're Ishmael. Yup, one bro. Yeah, it's it's repugnant to say the least. Hold on. I actually was thinking of making a fun video on Galatians 5:3, noting that if Christian Zionists want to say converts to Judaism are natural branch Muslims, might ironically qualify as such. Bro, like I was literally thinking about doing the same thing, so please do it. I would love to see your take on it. I was literally, I was literally thinking about doing the same thing, Phil.
Greetings. As was alluded to in the clip you just saw, in this video I want to explore the question, are Palestinians natural branches? And for those who might not understand the question or understand its significance, note that in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, in the 11th chapter of the Epistle to the Romans, the Apostle Paul refers to a certain tree which has some branches being broken off and other branches being grafted in. The branches which are grafted in are Gentile Christians, while the branches which are broken off are disbelieving Jews, or perhaps disbelieving Israelites, if you want to make a distinction between the two. Verse 18, which is to say Romans 11:18, warns the believers not to boast over, not to rejoice over, not to be arrogant towards the broken branches. And it's at this point that some Christian Zionists seek to establish grounds for reinforcing a special status for disbelieving Jews, and more specifically for modern Israelis. Now, to be clear, it is far from the only place in Scripture where they do that, but because it's common to have Christian Zionists try to employ the phrase natural branches or boast not against the natural branches to cover even the modern secular state called Israel, it seems fair to explore the question, what is a natural branch, what makes one a natural branch, and how many Palestinians might meet the relevant qualifications. However, before we dive in, let me first put forth a bit of a disclaimer. This video is going to mention both Jews, rabbinic Jews, and Muslims, and individuals from either of those communities might find this discussion confusing. Perhaps some might even find portions potentially insulting. But this video is not intended as a polemic against either Jews or Muslims. Rather, it is intended as a conversation between people who profess to be Christian, people who profess to believe in the New Testament. This is a discussion about the term natural branch, which is a term found in the New Testament, and this video will attempt to use different thought experiments to clarify vague discussions around that term. So, having stated that, let's get into the topic. A number of Christian Zionists will find the question on the screen just absurd, right? But before we just wave it off, let's first define natural branch. Now, the reality is that the Bible does not clearly define the term, and so different readers fill in the blanks with different assumptions. And as a result, they arrive at different conclusions. For example, while this isn't common amongst Christian Zionists, it is nonetheless the case that some think it refers to patrilineal descendants of Jacob. That aside, what I have found to be common is an idea that any line of descent is sufficient. Now, I'm not saying Rabbinic Judaism takes either a patrilineal or multilineal position, but nonetheless, there are Christian Zionists who take that view, right? And so a multilineal definition would be the view that just one of your many lines of descent, if just one of those lines goes back to Jacob, then you're a natural branch on this view. And aside from that, aside from those who hold to a patrilineal view or a multilineal view, still others take a view that I find particularly troubling. And it's the view that anyone who fits rabbinic halachic definition of Jew is a natural branch. On that view, even a convert to rabbinic Judaism would be a natural branch. And I find that troubling because it entails that a convert to a Christ-denying faith might have a more special status than converts to a Christ-affirming faith. But whatever the case, I'm willing, at least for the sake of argument, to work with different definitions, provided we handle them with consistency and intellectual honesty. And so, with that in mind, permit me to note that back on the 21st of December, I got to discuss these different approaches to the question, this question of defining natural branches, on an episode of Berean TV. And I'd like to play that segment now. So this clip is going to run for about 8.5 minutes. However, as a bit of a warning, let me also say that I joined the panel while I was at the office, and I was speaking somewhat off the cuff, and that resulted in my presentation being a bit sloppy. So after this clip, I'd like to unpack it a bit more. I'd like to attempt to clarify a few parts. There might be a little bit of repetition, but nonetheless, I think some clarification is necessary. But with that, here's the clip.
Oh, Abu, let me get Abu, because I know Abu is at work too.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Abu.
Yes, sir. If I can I just touch on why I think these questions are so important, why definitions are important. So let me just run through this really quickly, and I'll try to go through this really quickly. First off, even separate from discussions with Hebrew Israelites with regards to the state of Israel, definitions are important. So, for example, on a patrilineal definition of Israelite, if we're going to hold to that, I think it's clear that the majority of, for example, Ashkenazim are not going to meet that definition, right? And so therefore we wouldn't have to be forced to recognize the majority of them as quote unquote natural branches. But then some will say, and then I've seen a lot of Christian apologists say, well, I don't hold to a patrilineal definition. I hold to I think any line is sufficient. But if any line is sufficient, there's a real question about this. Think about how many, for example, for each generation you go back, the number of generations that can be set as the power over 2, right? So let me give you an example. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and it keeps doubling each generation you go back. So if you go back thousands of years, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of different ancestors. And so it raises the question, how if a multilineal view where as long as one of your lines goes back to Jacob, it's sufficient. Certain Christian apologists take this view. If that's the question, then how many Palestinians might fit that definition? I mean, it's possible that the majority of Palestinians might meet that definition, right? And then it would raise the question, well, how many Palestinians are natural branches, which have huge political implications for this whole Christian Zionist project? But then there's another deeper question here, and it's one that terrifies me on a certain level. It really bothers me when I meet Christians. And this is, by the way, let me make clear, I'm not applying this to Rabbi Eduardo. This has nothing to do with him. I'm talking in general. It bothers me when I meet people who say that converts to Judaism, not to Christianity, to Judaism suffice as quote unquote natural branches, because then the question becomes, what what is sufficient to meet that, right? So I want to run through a really quick scenario, because obviously, some might want to say, oh, well, it has to be conversion to some sort of Pharisaical form of Judaism. But I don't think the Bible forces us into that, right? The Bible seems to recognize the Sadducees, who were not Pharisees and not part of what became the rabbinic spectrum, as also Israelites who are clearly converting people as well. So the thing is, conversion is not limited to just the Pharisaical view. But then it raises the question, what would be sufficient for converts? So forgive me, I know I've been a bit long-winded. I want to run through a really quick scenario, right? Galatians 5:3, right? If I can paraphrase Galatians 5:3, it says, every man who gets circumcised is indebted to the whole of the law. Right now, obviously, that's not referring to people just merely circumcised. It's referring to people who think that they're obligated to get circumcised by God. So the scenario that I wanted to offer is this: suppose there's a man, right, who accepts Jesus as the Messiah, right, and suppose he also believes that circumcision is required, right? Now, imagine that guy in the first century talking with Paul, and imagine, him telling Paul that he believes that in order for one to be part of the covenant of Abraham, one must be circumcised, right? So this man intends to get circumcised, and he's converting, and not merely for health reasons, right? He's not merely for aesthetic reasons. Rather, he's going to get circumcised because he thinks it's a requirement for true followers of Jesus Christ and the true people of Abraham. Now, imagine Paul hits him with that line that I just mentioned in Galatians 5:3, right? Imagine Paul telling this man that if he goes this route, he's going to be judged under the old covenant. He's going to be treated as one who's part of the old covenant, right? And then suppose that man tries to explain to Paul that he has no intention to keep the whole of the law, right? As the Jewish authorities might understand it. For example, like, let's say this guy says, who's about to convert to the faith, and he's also going to get circumcised. Suppose he says, me personally, I eat shrimp. I just had shrimp this the other day, and he says that he fully intends to continue eating shrimp. So he rejects a lot of the Mosaic law or the popular Jewish Pharisaical interpretations, right? And he does so with neither fear nor regret, right? And then imagine that he adds that, he thinks the Jewish authorities who claim the Torah prohibits shrimp are, probably misinterpreting the text. And he also declares that even if the Torah did prohibit shrimp, he's confident that Jesus himself did away with that law, right? He thinks that we can eat shrimp now because maybe Jesus abrogated it, right? With Galatians 5:3 in mind, I suspect that Paul's answer would still be along the lines of, too bad if you get circumcised for the reasons you think, for the reasons that you're saying, you'll be judged as one under the old covenant. Now, with all of that in mind, the reason why I went on this long-winded rant is because that raises, if we can agree to that someone who rejects huge swaths of the Pharisaical system but adopts parts of the law can still be judged under the old covenant within a system where people are saying, oh, converts to the old covenant can also be natural branches. It would raise the question, why don't we include Muslims as natural branches? I know that was a long-winded thing, but the point I'm trying to get here on this rant is that how we define natural branches and how we define who is a natural branch or can become a natural branch, for those who think that one can convert into such, the finer details have huge implications, especially since a lot of people want to use this concept of the natural branch as a political football within the context of Christian Zionism, American foreign policy, and so forth. I think there's a lot of open questions about why we should exclude, for example, Palestinians from being natural branches. And forgive me for that long rant. I look forward to the comments of others.
No, and Abu, to your point, that's why I bring up the whole point of me having 2.9%. But none of my ancestors, none of my family practices certain practices. So am I entitled to
exactly for those Christians who say, oh, any line is sufficient, then you might have claim to be in a natural branch. Why not?
And then should I be, if I feel inclined to keep the law, right? Would that raise an issue?
Hey, Grace and Peace. Hey, can I ask a little question real quick before you?
Go ahead,
run, bro. Hey, Grace and Peace, panel, family, everybody in the chat.
Good morning.
Good morning, bro. So I'm just a little confused about you. I mean, I understand where you were going with it, but you said why not consider a Muslim? But isn't that a different faith system? It's not like saying a convert, like a nationality, such as like saying Palestinian or and it you're talking about somebody's like geographical location, like where they live, or talking about someone's quote unquote ethnicity. But you said why not include the Muslim? Isn't that an entire different faith system, though? Wouldn't
well,
it?
I think bloodline people to Abraham, though.
Yeah, I would think it really depends on what we mean. Like, for example, obviously, rabbinic Judaism, which is what people were proposing, convert to rabbinic Judaism, that would be conversion to a completely different religion from Christianity. And then rabbinic Judaism itself splits on conceptions of God. There are rabbinic Jews who are fiercely Unitarian in their conception of God, and then there's other rabbinic Jews who flirt with these weird conceptions of God that seem to get multi-personal, or even panentheistic, and so it gets a little weird. And so within that scope, and then on top of that, rabbinic Jews, I know a lot of American Christians want to say, oh, the Muslims worship another God. I think someone even said that in the chat, but the rabbinic Jews seem to think that the Muslims worship the same God as them. And so being that the Muslims claim the God of Abraham, right? Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying being a Muslim makes one a natural branch. What I was saying was, for those Christians, especially those Christian Zionists who want to play a game where they say, oh, if you convert to the old covenant, your conversion even makes you a natural branch, which is a position I find disgusting. But being that that's part of a political football that's used within the context of Christian Zionism, what I want to put out there is, keeping Galatians 5:3 in mind, maybe Muslims qualify as natural branches under that view, a view I reject, that conversion to the old covenant makes you a natural branch.
Listen,
I can clarify more if you need.
Okay, so as I said before the start of that clip, I was speaking while at the office, and I was speaking off the cuff, as it were, and therefore my presentation was a bit hasty, a bit sloppy, and therefore it could benefit from some clarification. So in an attempt to unpack that just a bit, let me note that there are basically three main points here. Now, I know in the text that was emblazoned on the screen during the clip, there were 4 points listed, but the third and fourth points can be lumped together. So here are the three main points. The first point is with regard to a patrilineal definition of Israelite. The second point is with regard to a multilineal definition of Israelite. And then the third point is the question of conversion and how Galatians 5:3 might relate to that, and where Muslims might fall on such a view. So let's begin with that first point, which will require the least discussion. A patrilineal definition of Israelite posits that an Israelite is defined as one who descends from Jacob, the biblical Jacob, on his strict paternal line. His father's 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 line has to go all the way back to Jacob. And it seems to be that not a lot of Christian Zionists hold to this definition, but it is nonetheless fairly easy to see the emphasis on patrilineal descent in the Bible. And at least in theory, converts to the faith of Israel prior to the advent of Christ can be seen as pre-Christian grafted branches. In short, it is possible to have a patrilineal definition of natural branch, which restricts the natural branches to just the patrilineal descendants of Jacob. And with that in mind, a number of genetic studies have made it pretty clear, abundantly clear, that mainstream Jews are very diverse patrilineally. It's interesting that, for example, Ashkenazim are so diverse patrilineally that no haplogroup has a majority amongst them. And that would mean that no matter what haplogroup we assign to the biblical Jacob, for the sake of hypothetical argument, it could be haplogroup E1B1B or J1 or J2 or even R1 or R1A, whatever it is that you assign hypothetically to the biblical Jacob, a majority of Ashkenazim will not have that haplogroup, which would then mean that even without knowing Jacob's haplogroup, we still have strong grounds on which to say that a majority of Ashkenazim do not descend paternally from the biblical Jacob. Multiple studies have shown that for Ashkenazim, and it seems that at least one study has shown that Sephardim are apparently in a similar situation in terms of patrilineal diversity. And so, perhaps that applies to the Jewish spectrum as a whole. Now, if one wants to say that some within the Jewish spectrum have the right haplogroup, I would happily agree. But I think it's likely that so too some Palestinians have whatever haplogroup that might be as well. But, maybe this is a minor point, so let's move on to that second point, which is with regard to a multilineal definition of Israelite. And as was alluded to earlier, this is a more expansive definition of Israelite. Rather than limiting the definition to just a single ancestral line, like the strict paternal line, it treats any line as sufficient. In short, on this model, as long as just one of a person's many ancestors descends from Jacob, then that person is an Israelite. While this approach delivers the mainstream Jewish community, from the challenges of a patrilineal definition, I don't think proponents of this approach realize just how expansive it is, and to what extent it makes room for a great many others. And while this video is focusing on Palestinians, let me share one more clip which is relevant to the Hebrew Israelite spectrum. I briefly discussed this on Orthodox Moor's channel back in May of 2022. And there I noted that a multilineal definition of Israelite might encompass even the majority of the African diaspora in the Americas. So let me play a 3-minute excerpt, and then I'm going to attempt to elaborate on the idea. Here's the clip.
Okay. Boo, what's your stance on it?
Oh, I have no idea. If we're asking about patrilineal Israelites, I don't, I haven't settled on a position, so I have no idea. But I would have to assume some. I mean, I've sort of been the odd man out amongst the different apologists, but I've long been saying that just Deuteronomy 28:64, which talks about Israel being spread into every nation, I've long said that, I would take it for granted that includes the West African diaspora. So some, how many, what percentage? No idea. No idea.
So so for me, and I gotta switch up the question now, because so for me, I don't do things where I just patrilineal descent, right? So I do mother, father, and also conversion and whatnot, right? And so
by that definition, you could get the majority.
Well, but okay, so I
agree.
Yeah.
Can I give you an example of this? Like this, again, this is where the models come in. There was a discussion, I can't remember how long ago it was. It was less than a year ago. There was a discussion between Faithful and Yehuchanan, right? Mm-hmm. And Yehuchanan was not insisting on a patrilineal definition. He was saying, you can't say that none of my lines go back to Abraham. And so subsequent to that discussion, the conversation that I had with Faithful off of line was that I was saying that when you look at how diverse his DNA is, and when you think about what it means to say like just one of any of his many lines, you would have to think that the odds are in his favor if that's what he's going for,
Oh, so basically,
enough, what's his name? Steven Anderson touches on this in his documentary, Marching to Zion, which is a documentary I love. I'm not necessarily a fan of Steven Anderson, but I like that documentary a lot. And he touches on this idea of if it's just any one of your ancestors, if that's the question we're asking, not just strictly your paternal line, man, there's a lot of people that would fit that definition, you know? And that was something I was saying after Faithful's discussion with Hyrcanus. Like if I was going to bet on that, and let's say God gives an angel an envelope and now he can reveal whether or not one of Hyrcanus' ancestors goes back to an Israelite, man, I'm going to bet in favor of yes, you know, if we're talking about all his lines of descent, you know, because we're talking about thousands of lines ultimately, you know?
Facts.
Understood.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense actually, because you go back with your grandparents, you have four grandparents, then you have 16 great grandparents, and then you just keep going back further and further and further. You know, you're bound to have some Jewish person within your ancestry. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so to elaborate on what was being said there, think of it this way. Let the variable n stand for any positive number. If you go back n generations, then the number of ancestors you will have within that generation is 2 to the power of n. So for example, if you go back 1 generation, then the number of ancestors within that generation is 2 to the power of 1, which is to say 2. You have 2 parents. And if you go back 2 generations, you have 4 grandparents. And when you go back 3 generations, you have 8 great-grandparents. And it keeps doubling with each generation that you go back. Now imagine that spread out over 2,000 or 3,000 years. For example, let's say that over the last 100 generations, the average span is 20 years per generation, which is to say, the number of years from when an individual is born to when they become a parent, right? So let's say it's 20 years per generation. Those 100 generations would take you back 2,000 years. And if you doubled the number of ancestors each generation for 100 generations, you'd arrive at this massively large number, 31 digits long. In the larger text on your screen, I have 12,676,506 times 10 to the 23rd power. But even that number would be less than the actual figure, which can be seen in the smaller text. And for Americans, that's a short scale nonillion. And those using long scale would call it a long scale quintillion. Now, obviously, there were not that many humans on the earth 2,000 years ago. So a lot of your ancestors, as you go back in time, are going to begin to overlap more and more, which is to say, if you had a fully mapped out tree, a single person would appear on multiple branches. And that would happen more often the farther you went back. But even if the actual number of physical persons would be smaller, the fact remains that it is hard to see what would preclude a single descendant from Jacob from appearing on at least one of those many, many branches. So on the one hand, I do think that a multilineal definition would allow for the overwhelming majority of mainstream Jews to be Israelites, perhaps 99%, but so too it would make room for a lot of other groups, such as a great many non-Jewish Europeans, various folks on the One West Tribes chart, perhaps the majority of them, and most central to this video, Palestinians, right? Perhaps the majority of Palestinians, right? That's the central question here. What would preclude a huge percentage of Palestinians, perhaps even the majority of Palestinians, from falling within such an expansive definition? Food for thought. And with that, we now get to the third point, which was on the question of conversion. You see, there are some who argue that if a non-Israelite converts to Christianity, they're a mere grafted branch. But if that same non-Israelite converts to Judaism, he becomes a natural branch. And as I alluded to earlier, this is a view that I find rather disturbing. Nonetheless, that view raises a question. What is the bare minimum sufficient for conversion? As I noted in the clip, some Christian Zionists want to say that it has to be a rabbinic conversion, which is to say only a conversion to the faith which evolved out of the Pharisaical system can be legitimate. But honestly, there's nothing in Scripture necessitating such a view. In the clip that you saw, I briefly mentioned conversion under the Sadducees, though I may have placed a bit too much emphasis on that. As I said, I was speaking somewhat hastily, and I say that I may have done that, put a little bit too much emphasis, because in reality, we don't have a lot of information on that, on Sadducee conversion. But I would note that, for example, Alexander Yanai was a supporter of the Sadducees and also had close relations with Edomite converts. So too, Hurqanos, who himself forcibly converted the Edomites, wound up joining the Sadducee side. Now, admittedly, his switch came after that forced conversion of the Edomites, but Hyrcanus continued to have good relations with various patrilineally Edomite Jews, all of which would allow us to think that the Sadducees likewise permitted conversion, even if they were the smaller party compared to the Pharisees. Now, on an admittedly speculative side note, I have seen some commentaries wonder aloud if the way that Matthew 16:6 refers to the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, while Mark 8:15 instead refers to the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod, might contain within it an intended association or conflation of Herod with the Sadducees. But whatever the case, putting the Sadducees aside, the question nonetheless remains, assuming for the sake of argument that conversion to a natural branch is possible, what is the bare minimum sufficient for such a conversion? As I alluded to a moment ago, there's nothing in the scriptures which limits such to specifically post-biblical rabbinic Judaism. The verse I referenced in that longer clip from Berean TV, which is Galatians 5:3, that verse seems to set a different standard. If you had a man who affirmed the God of Abraham and who affirmed that Jesus is the Messiah and who rejected disbelieving Pharisaical authority but still believed that circumcision is obligatory to be part of the faith of Abraham, according to Galatians 5:3, he would be obligated to keep the whole of the old law, which would seem to mean that he would be treated as one under the old covenant. Now, I realize that some might have been confused by my Muslim analogy in that clip from Berean TV, but the point was that some Muslims, not all Muslims, but a great many Muslims, hold that circumcision remains obligatory for men. Some of those same Muslims would say it's permissible to eat shrimp or eat dairy and meat at the same time. And there are various other examples of how they do not see themselves as being under the entirety of the Mosaic law or the rabbinic interpretation of the Mosaic law, right? So it would seem that many Muslims would fall well within that scenario about Galatians 5:3, right? Believers, professed believers in the God of Abraham, professed believers in the Messiahship of Jesus, those who say that circumcision remains obligatory for those in the faith of Abraham, yet who don't see themselves as under the entirety of the law. It seems that Galatians 5:3 might apply to them, at least within this context of a discussion amongst believers in the New Testament. And therefore, it would raise the question, have those Muslims been converted into natural branches? Now, at this point, I want to reiterate something that I said earlier, and that's that I do not intend this video as a polemic against either rabbinic Jews or Muslims. Rather, again, as I said earlier, this is intended as a conversation between professed Christians, between professed believers in the New Testament. There are Christian Zionists who will insinuate that Israelis deserve a special status because they are natural branches. But if, hypothetically speaking, one can be converted into a natural branch, then it would seem a great many Muslims, including a great many Muslim Palestinians, might qualify as natural branches as well. At least if we can understand Galatians 5:3 as placing them under the Old Covenant. So in short, the point of this video is that some Christian Zionists want to quickly throw out the phrase natural branches, and they want to do that as a way to raise the status of Israelis while simultaneously diminishing the status of Palestinians, at least in the minds of believers in the New Testament. My intention in this video was to ask people to slow down that conversation and ask, how do we define natural branch? And how do we determine who fits that definition? Depending on the definition of natural branch, it may be the case that less Israelis are natural branches than you might have first thought. And, or perhaps more Palestinians are natural branches than you might have first thought. So in short, if someone is going to invoke the natural branches, they need to clarify what they think that means and how they apply it to modern individuals. It can't just be, I said natural branches, therefore the Israelis are raised up and the Palestinians are diminished. No, it can't be that. We need to slow that conversation down, right? How do you define natural branch and how do you determine who fits it? Food for thought. But with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. So feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. I intended this video merely as a conversation starter, so there is definitely more to be said. And I look forward to anyone's thoughts, whether or objections. So like I said, share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.
ولتجدن أقربهم مودة للذين آمنوا الذين قالوا إنا نصارى